Hello, my name is Dr. Rodney Davis, and I am an associate professor at Troy University and a Fulbright Senior Scholar. It's my pleasure to be a part of the Global Researchers Association and Convergence for Excellence First International Conference in Baguio City. I realize that this is a bit unusual, having a presenter appear by video, but because of my teaching responsibilities, I'm not able to be there right now. And so what you're going to see in my session is I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share with you, and the organizers of the conference will have this presentation to give you a copy should you want one. My video will be at the beginning here and then at the end. During the presentation itself, you'll hear the audio of me, so I'm kind of giving you a heads up. You're not going to see my face the entire time. So if that makes you happy, great, glad to hear that. If it makes you sad, well, there's not much I can do because of the size of the file and transmitting it. So we're going to get into the presentation at this point, and there'll be some time at the end for questions, and one of the moderators that will be there will handle your questions. There'll be information about how you can contact me should you have any questions about my presentation or scheduling of future conferences. So let's go ahead and get started.
My presentation is entitled Pressures in Research, Trends and Issues in U.S. Research. I have been given the task today to kind of give you an overview of some of the trends that we're seeing in research here in the United States, as well as some of the issues that researchers need to consider. And I'm giving you this information more from my perspective as a researcher at the institution where I work at. So I wouldn't necessarily say that these are overly generalized trends or issues, but I think that from scanning the literature as well as talking with colleagues at various institutions, many of the things that I'm going to talk to you about are things that concern researchers and probably then are issues that you should be aware of in the Philippines. Now, I know that there will be some correlation between what I say and what you're experiencing there. And yet, at the same time, there are going to be cases where much of what I'm addressing is not necessarily something that's going to impact you. So this is, again, giving you more of an international perspective. It is not looking at other countries besides the United States. Again, these issues, I think, transcend national boundaries, and you'll see that as we get in it. Now, there are probably far more issues that need to be brought up than just the ones I've addressed, but I think these are fairly common to researchers who are entry-level researchers, as well as those who have a few years under their belts. And so let's go ahead and begin to look at these trends and issues that researchers are impacted by. I will probably not get a great deal of argument from anyone in the audience today when I make the statement that professors work long hours. And by professors, I'm talking about those who are instructor level in the Philippines, assistant, associate, and full professors, and even lecturers to that matter. When you look at the data that was compiled by the Boise State University study on how much time professors spend actually working, you'll see here that it's 60 plus hours, 61 hours to be exact. And that is 1.5 times the normal work week of any other professional in the country. Here in the United States, the typical work week is 40 hours. And again, that may not be the same in other countries, but here we have that minimum work week of 40 hours to be considered a full-time employee. But when you look at how their time is allocated over that 61 hours, look at the top box here. 17% of their time, and you can do the math to figure out what 17% of 61 is spent in meetings. Now, meetings here refers to meetings that a professor might attend because of a committee that he or she is on. These could be search committee meetings. These could be discipline-specific meetings. They could even be meetings with students that are not necessarily related to classwork or to an academic research study that's being conducted. In my case, many of our meetings are conducted using internet communication devices because the faculty in my department are spread out between two campuses, and these two campuses are 2 hours apart. And so to really maximize our time within the discipline, we use the internet to conduct these meetings. And so I would say that probably a good part of my time is spent in meetings with college-level administrators within the department that my program is located, as well as with my colleagues in the program that I actually teach in. I thought interesting that 13%, almost the same amount of time, is spent using email. That's reading and answering email messages. It is the preferred way of communicating. In times past, it used to be that students would come visit their professor at the university and make an appointment, and there would be an hour of your time talking with students about homework or classwork or courses or registration, advisement, and things like that. Now, because we are a more transient population, and because we're a commuter campus, the Dothan campus of Troy University serves predominantly a graduate population, and our students typically drive between 1 and 2 hours to campus for class. They rarely come in anymore for meetings with faculty. Meetings are handled by the phone. Most contact happens by email, and then some through internet resources like WebEx, where we can have visual face-to-face meetings over the internet, which I think they call telephone over the internet. So when you add these together, you have 30% of the professor's time delegated to related to non-academic kinds of activities. The next, even a larger percentage of the time, which makes sense, about 35% of their time is spent in teaching. And what they're saying, of that 35%, about 12% instruction, 11% course administration. Obviously, instruction is the physical teaching of the class. Course admin can be grading papers, working on syllabi, developing syllabi. If it's an online class, it could also relate to discussion posts, posting classes online, what it takes to make the class happen. And then about 5% of their time then is left to research itself. I find that interesting because as I've looked at the data on how much time does it take for professors to have a very active agenda and to be publishing sufficiently and consistently, it's typically 2 to 8 hours a day. That's the continuum. In some cases, professors are spending 8 hours a day working on research, and as little as 2 hours. Obviously, the more time you spend, and that's what the data is indicating, the more time you spend in research, the more productive you're going to be. But that is a challenge when we look at how much time that this person has during the course of the work week. 65% of their time is just tied up in non-academic things and teaching. A very small percentage of this time would be spent in research, and that really doesn't even add up to 35%. I'm sure that there is a great deal of miscellaneous time that's spent photocopying, getting things, talking with colleagues, and so forth and so on. But it's not just during the week that faculty are spending their time working. We're also seeing this take place on the weekends. And when you look at how faculty members spend their weekends, a great deal of their time is spent in course preparation, and that would be about 23%. In my own case, I do a lot of my preparation on the weekends, because if I'm teaching an online class, I have things load on the course management system on Monday at 12:01 a.m. So I take Saturday and Sunday to get ready for that. I also spend my Saturday and Sunday grading papers, because all of my assignments for my online class are due on Sunday. I'm grading the discussion threads, so that throughout the week I may grade some papers, but a lot of that time during the week is spent interacting with the students. And of course, if I have a face-to-face class, then that block of time, that 3 to 4 hours, is tied up actually teaching. So 23% of the time is spent in class preparation, 13% in course admin, 10% on email. Because you see, we are 7 days a week checking that email, and most of us have it so that the email goes to our cell phone, so no matter where we are, we can stay in touch with those students. And if a student needs us, we can respond. And then about 9% of our time in professional development. Many of the conferences in the United States are like they are in the Philippines. They are conducted on the weekends. And so your whole weekend is, of course, devoted to professional development. But what I've observed is that universities are allocating less and less resources for professional development for faculty. They want you publishing. They want you researching, conducting research. And this is true across the spectrum of teaching institutions as well as research institutions. So there isn't a lot of time devoted to professional development. Now, of course, in the Philippines, it's a little bit different with the requirements for professional development that help you advance in rank. Certainly, professional development in the United States is important, but it is not oftentimes relegated to tenure and promotion process. As a matter of fact, in many cases, you need to have it, but it is not a major factor in making that decision about obtaining tenure and being promoted. It's just not. Research productivity is the key factor, and then service to the university and teaching fall underneath that. So busy professors, and no one will argue that they aren't busy, also have added stress piled on top, more pressure piled on them because of this idea of publish or perish. It's a harsh reality. Now, this term publish or perish, we've heard it in higher education for years. Here's where the term came from. It was first used in an academic context back in 1938. Logan Wilson wrote the book entitled The Academic Man, A Study in the Sociology of a Profession. And in there, he referred to this new pressure put upon faculty that they must be producers of research, producers of manuscripts. And really this fits here in the United States. During that period of time, there were a great deal of research grants that were available, and so professors were seeking these funding sources to conduct their research. And what really has transpired since that time is an increasing emphasis on research because of how it impacts the reputation of the institution as well as the reputation of the professor, the individual, and how that it can be bringing in large sums of monies. And of course, endowments are big deals to universities because of the funding method here in the United States. Even public universities, state universities, are getting less and less money from the government. Troy University now gets less than 24% of its annual budget from the federal government or state government. And in this case, that means that about 75% of what the university needs to operate has to come from grants, endowments, and student tuition. Well, that puts an increased pressure then on the institution itself because they've got to make up those endowments and those grants, which means they need faculty who maybe are not noted for their teaching ability as much as they are noted for writing grants and conducting research. So what we find then with this issue of publish or perish is what is it that these professors are really being hired to do? Are they being hired to teach or are they being hired to conduct research? And I will submit to you that it is the latter. They are being hired to conduct research, not about their teaching ability. And of course, at research institutions, that makes sense. But what we're seeing is there is a change even at teaching institutions where the expectation at the time of employment is that you are going to be productive and you're going to have a research agenda and be able to work that through the first 5 years of your employment. Okay, so why the emphasis on publish or perish? Well, first of all, we know that it is the main way, and there are only a few ways to do this, but it is a main way to demonstrate academic talent. And oftentimes, how does a professor show that he is a leader in his field? Not just as an effective instructor and a communicator of information, but how does he or she communicate to the university that I am somebody who is well known in my field, I am an expert in my field? Well, that happens oftentimes through their research and the publications that they produce. Secondly, we also note, and I had mentioned earlier, that the reason for the emphasis on publication or perishing, in other words, meaning if you don't publish, you'll lose your job, is that publishing manuscripts brings a recognition to the scholar, but it also brings a recognition to their university because the name of the scholar is on the article or the manuscript, but also the name of the institution is on that list, and they want to see their name in print. Universities do, so do individuals. Third, publishing can bring funding to the university because many of the research grants have a requirement that at the end of the grant, when the data is collected, that there is going to be the generation of some kind of report, whether it be a manuscript in a journal or a statistical report is going to be presented to the funder or to a government agency, whoever may be sponsoring the grant. And in that case, the name of the funding source is going to get out. So even the people funding grants want to see their name in print. And so it can be a way of getting money into the university. Because in many cases here in the United States, when you get a grant, as I have just recently gotten one, it's a $113,000 grant for Troy University. Now, of that $113,000, I have to give 8% of that to the university. And that 8% is supposed to cover the management of the grant. and pay for the accountants and the people to do all the things that they do to support the grant. That 8% comes right off the top. And in some cases, it's even higher. Now, this particular grant that I wrote had a limit of no more than 8%. Some grants will allow you to give those indirect costs of up to 14%. So I'm looking at just a little over $10,000 to my university for me to operate this grant for them. So imagine if these are larger grants that universities are getting, multiple $1-million grants, or they have more faculty who are writing the grants, and even small grants can add up when you have 5 or 6 people writing a $50,000 or $100,000 grant. So it is a way to bring money into the university. And of course, the number of publications is a metric that the university uses to measure a professor's competency. If they're producing research, that must mean they know what they're doing. Now, I know that it's a generalization, and I understand that people might question that, but it is a way for the university to have a better understanding of the value of this individual by how many articles they have published and in what journals these articles might also be published in. On the alternative, then those who are not publishing on a regular basis, they're not consistent in their publishing, or they're focusing on other activities altogether, like teaching and service, may find that they struggle to get jobs because universities are not hiring people who have not gotten a really consistent research agenda going. For example, if you were an assistant professor and you were trying to get a job at another institution and you really had no publications to your credit, most universities will not hire you. Even if you had 5 years experience, but you had no publications, they're not going to take a chance on you because they want to hire people who have the possibility of conducting research. Now, especially if you're an associate professor, you should have a serious publication record, and that should be noteworthy if you're going to go on up for full professor or you want to transfer to another institution. Now, if you're just starting out in higher education, then many of the universities are willing to take a chance on you if they can see that you have potential to be a researcher. Unfortunately, many universities are not guiding the researchers, these entry-level researchers in this area, and of course they struggle because they really don't know how to conduct research and how to really manage their time between teaching responsibilities and the research responsibilities that they may have. So ultimately then what happens is we have professors who find that at the end of 5 years they are not offered tenure and they're out of a job because they have not been diligent in making sure that they are conducting research. Even at Troy, we've had several faculty members in the College of Education who were not granted tenure because they did not have a significant research agenda in force. Expectations for faculty have been changing really since the early part of the 20th century. Now we have two different types of universities here in the United States, and this is fairly common throughout most of the Western world, that you really break down institutions by whether they are a research institution and or a teaching institution, and even research institutions can divide themselves even more by whether they're a Research 1 or a Research 2 institution, meaning are they a Tier 1 research institution or Tier 2? Harvard being an example of a Tier 1 research institution, whereas the University of Alabama is probably a Tier 2 research institution. And in those research institutions, historically, it was acceptable that a professor would produce 2 publications a year. 2 original works every year. And in order to do that, professors were granted graduate assistants, they were granted access to labs, they were granted secretarial support, any student support that they needed, reduced teaching loads, all of those kinds of things in order to allow them to focus the majority of their time on research and maybe the rest of the time on their teaching. Now they've kind of taken away the idea that you should have 2 publications a year and come with a more generic term of consistent scholarship. And you'll see that in the literature. They'll talk about how productive a person was over the course of 5 years. So what this says is there may be 1 year where you're really spending a lot of time putting things in the old research pipeline, and you don't see many publications that year, but then the next year you may have 4 or 5 manuscripts published, and the year after that you may see 2 or 3, and then 5 or 6, and so as the pipeline is filled up with your manuscripts, it may not be a consistent 2 every year, whereas it may kind of go in spurts, and that seemingly seems to be what is more acceptable, having a consistent research agenda. At the teaching institution, that historically has not been the case. The emphasis was always on the teaching and making sure that was the area where you put the most of your time, and then if you wrote a manuscript and submitted it for publication, that was great. That was the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. That was the cherry on top of the hallow. But the reality is, teaching institutions have begun to realize they want access to those funds, those endowments, those research grants, and they are pressuring faculty to be more active in their research. Now, they're not going to the point of saying that research take precedence over teaching, but I have seen at my institution that if you're going to get tenure, you're going to have at least 2 articles. Most likely you'd be safer with 3 articles in print at the time that you come up for tenure. Now, when I first started at the university, it was a focus on teaching. There wasn't the demand for research. And it changed over the course of the year, so that right about the time I went up for tenure, they said, you should be having journal publications and things like that. And I said, wait a minute, I've been here 5 years, you hadn't said anything about this, and now you're telling me here's what the expectation is. Now, I had written another grant at that point, a $100,000 grant, and of course that made the difference. They could see that I had done quite a bit, a lot of presentations and things like that. But I say that to emphasize that even at teaching institutions, the demand has changed and is shifting more towards a focus on research. And while even at Troy, they don't want to put a number to how much you have to do, and they use the term that you should have a consistent research agenda. We have to turn one in every year and show what we're doing and show the progress that we're making. But it hasn't gotten to the point where we're setting a number anymore. They kind of use it as a guideline. So it seems as though the challenge here with expectations is also frustrating faculty, because at the teaching institutions, they do not have the resources available to them that the research institutions have. And so they're asking professors to conduct research with heavy teaching loads. Now, I understand in the Philippines that you guys have an extremely heavy teaching load. And I have friends there who teach 7 preps a day. And how they find time to publish anything is a mystery to me. Because in the United States, the average teaching load for a graduate faculty member is 3 courses a semester, and that means they'll teach maybe 3 days a week, and it won't be all day. It'll be a 4-hour block of time or a 2-hour block of time, but not from 8 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They're not teaching all of that time. So we have a much reduced teaching expectation. So I understand you might laugh at me when I say, wow, we have a heavy load. But as a teaching institution, undergraduate faculty would teach 4 classes, graduate would teach 3. But at a research institution, a professor might only teach 2 or 1 course over the course of the semester. So you can see there are a lot more resources that the research institution has provided for their faculty, which is why they're more productive. And so, yeah, it's very frustrating to a faculty member at a teaching institution because it seems that administrators are pushing us towards the keep up with the research institution, and here we're not even going to help you. We're going to throw some barriers in your way because we're going to put you on all kinds of committees. So right now it's at that very tenuous place where we're having to do the research at teaching institutions, but not necessarily being given the resources that the Research One institutions have. So expectations are changing. That's a big issue. There's a lot of conversation and debate over what is realistic and what's not. Another issue that comes up in discussions about kind of the things going on in research here in the United States is the quality of the research. And there is a citation index here. It's a Journal of Citation Index, actually, and you have it there, I'm sure, in the Philippines as well. And what it does is it measures the value and acceptance of research. And it does it by how much the article is cited, and by whom is it cited, and how often is it cited. Now think about this. 45% of the manuscripts that were published in the last 5 years in the top 4,500 journals were cited within the last 5 years of their publication. In other words, most, not even half, but a little less than half of the articles that were published in well-respected journals were cited in 5 years since the time they're published. Now think about this. When you look at that number that were published, only 42% of the journal articles were given 1 citation or more. And in almost 25% of the cases, that 1 citation was made by the author of the article in another journal article. And you will see some people who do this unscrupulously. They will publish an article and they will cite their previous work because that increases the number of citations. But look at that. A quarter of the publications were cited only by the author himself or herself in another journal. But look in red here. What does that mean? Here's the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen. The majority of research that is published is uncited by another person. And so I have to ask myself, what is the point of publishing the research? And I have come to this conclusion, and I am not alone in this conclusion. I've seen others who have mirrored and repeated the same conclusion, which is this: the bulk of the research that is being conducted today is for the sake of publishing only. It is not contributing to our knowledge base. It is not contributing to our understanding. It is only for the use of tenure and promotion, which also suggests that the research is of very low quality. So here's what this means. Research is not appreciated by the peers, which is why it's not being cited, nor is it of any real value to the discipline, because it is not being cited. Here's your takeaway. Research that is of low quality, because it's not being cited, suggests that the work is not significant or it's inconclusive. People are publishing just to publish. Now, I know that could raise a lot of discussion in the room, and I wish I was there to hear it, because I'd like to hear your take on why we publish. Is it just because we have to in order to maintain a job? Is it just because we're doing it to get a job? Get that tenure, get that contract that comes from year to year? I don't know. But I do suspect, as I'm looking at these figures, that probably it's more of the latter. We're doing it just to maintain the job. And because we're seeing a lot of research published, almost dumping it out there to get published, we're also seeing at the same time an increase, a proliferation, as it were, of journals. Every week I get emails from organizations about a journal that they're publishing that is in conjunction with a conference that they are hosting. And I can submit my article for their conference and it will be considered for their journal publication, or I can submit it for their journal and also present it at the conference if I wish, or not. Journals are just popping up right and left. Now, here is one statistic that I found very interesting, that there is an estimate that currently there are just 25,000 to 40,000 scientific research journals being published today. Now, keep in mind, 40,000 journals, that is in one discipline. If you think of education, the humanities, the social sciences, psychology, and all of the various disciplines, I would suspect that the number of journals being published every year is probably close to 100,000 journals. Now, in this figure here, I'm not talking about just the United States. I'm thinking probably worldwide. We're looking at 100,000 journals published every year. That is a phenomenal figure. But what even makes it more phenomenal is what's right next to it. 96% of those journals are published online and online only. Now, in the 90s, there was a combination online and paper print journal. Nowadays, most journals are only published online. And if you want a paper copy of the journal, you end up paying more for it to get the paper copy than you could if you just got the online journal. And there's a whole series of reasons to why people like electronic journals, online journals, versus the paper copy. And I don't want to spend time talking about that at this point. But note that most journals now are solely online. And that raises the question about the quality of the journal. How do we know? Now, the traditional ranking system for journals is this. There is a Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. And what that Tier 1 refers to is the impact that journal has on the field and on the discipline itself. So notice that the impact factor next to a Tier 1 journal is a 3 to 4. A Tier 2 journal would be an impact factor of 2 to 3. Tier 3 Tier 3 journal would be an impact factor of 1 to 2. And again, remember, impact factor refers to the number of citations that the manuscript received in the previous 2 years. And so what they do in order to calculate that figure is they divide the number of citations in the journal citation index for that manuscript year by the number of articles published in the previous 2 years in that journal. So if you think of an impact factor of 1, what does that mean? It means that on average, that an article published in the last 2 years would have been cited 1 time. Same thing if it was an impact factor of 4, that an article would have been cited 4 different times within that year. So we're seeing in a lot of journals that articles and manuscripts are not cited at all. And then I was just looking at the average, trying to see if there's an average number of citations, and I could not find that. But I noticed in looking at one Journal of Citation Index that there were journals that had 6 and 7 as the impact factor, which meant that the articles in that journal typically were cited 6 and 7 times. And these were Tier 1 journals, which meant that there are people reading them, and this work is so significant that people are wanting to address it in their own articles, cite it in their own articles. So what do we take away from this explosion of journals out there? And these can be peer-reviewed journals as well as non-peer-reviewed. And when you look at this number of 100,000, I would suspect that there's a great number of them that are not peer-reviewed. But at any point, what you need to do as a researcher is take a great deal of care in choosing journals in which to publish your research. You need to be sure that this is a high-quality journal. And if it says it's Tier 1, then you need to look up its impact factor. You need to look at those issues that who's publishing this article. And we're going to talk more about that next. What makes this a Tier 1 journal? To be sure that if you're going to get it submitted, that you are turning it into a legitimate and well-respected journal. Because there are a lot of them out there that are published by individuals that pose as groups. I know of one organization. They identify themselves as a research group, but it really is only one guy that is responsible for this organization. And he may have a few helpers, but he is doing most of the reviews, and he's not really doing what I call peer-reviewed, where it's independent, double-blind peer review, external peer review. It's not. It's oftentimes in-house review. So you have to be careful out there, because anybody can claim to be a journal, and they can claim a group and make it look like they have all the trappings of a well-respected organization, and they may be just the opposite. So you want to make sure that you are getting credit for the research that you're doing, and you want to put it in a well-respected journal. With the proliferation of journals out there, online and even in paper, a question comes up with, well, how do I determine the quality of the journal? It's not going to tell you that it's a Tier 1 or a Tier 3 journal. So what do I look at? Well, commonly people look at acceptance rates. And they say, well, if it's got a low acceptance rate, that means it's a better journal. And that's really what the definition of acceptance rate is. And how we factor that is, it's the number of manuscripts that are accepted for publication compared to the number of manuscripts that were considered in 1 year. So here's the assumption that people make. Well, if they have a high rejection rate, aka also known as low acceptance rate, it indicates it must be a high quality journal. Keep in mind that the acceptance rate is an internal measure used by the editor of the journal, not as an external measure like impact factor. Impact factor is an external measure. The number of times a particular article in a journal is cited. That's its impact. But that's external to the journal. They don't have any control over that. But acceptance rates, they do. Now, keep in mind that most journals do not publish their acceptance rates. It's not commonly done. Now, it can be found, and there are indexing services like Cabell's Indexing and Unger's, and I think there's a social science index that typically is used in Asia that will publish the acceptance rates for a particular journal. But keep in mind, that's not publicly made known by the editor of the journal, and they don't usually set out at the beginning of the year and say, oh, we're going to have an acceptance rate of 30%. In other words, we're going to reject 70% of what comes in. There are factors that go into that decision, and really that first factor is how many manuscripts are considered versus the number of manuscripts that are needed. Keep in mind, how often does the journal get published? Obviously, a journal that is published every week or every month is going to need more submissions than a journal that's published quarterly. And it depends, of course, on how many manuscripts are needed to complete an issue. Some journals have 10 articles in their journal, and they set the page restrictions. So they expect the minimum number of pages to be 20 pages for a journal, which means maybe they only have 5 articles, 6 articles that they have to have. But if they produce this journal every month, they need to have a well of manuscripts from which to draw. So again, the first factor is how much do they need? Secondly, what is the quality of the manuscripts that are being considered? Now, if the journal is scientific, then it may take more generalized research, and especially if it's not what they call a specialty journal. They might take a broader range of research and therefore accept more than maybe a specialty journal, because that may look, the editors of a specialty journal may look at the novelty of the research. They're looking for new, cutting-edge research, not stuff that's kind of a broader audience and would have an appeal to a broader group of people. So if they're not getting high-quality journal articles, then they're probably going to reject more. And just because a journal article has a few spelling mistakes in it, and it shouldn't have any, in my opinion, but even if it does, that oftentimes does not disqualify it. But if the research isn't sound, if the research isn't novel enough, then it's probably going to get rejected. And there may be a review rewrite process. Some journals, they reject it outright. There's no rewrite. Others will accept it, but you're going to have to rewrite this portion, rewrite that part. So it again depends on the need of the journal. Lastly, and this I don't think is very common, but I can see it in the journals myself, is the prestige or reputation of the journal. If it's a high prestige journal, they're probably going to have a very low acceptance rate because they're going to have a number of manuscripts submitted, a large number submitted. Everyone is going to want to have their research in that journal because it is the premier journal, and every discipline has a premier journal. And if you're not at one of the Ivy League institutions or one of the really large, well-known research institutions, you're not going to get an article in that journal. And so that's why we have multiple tiers of journals, because not everybody can publish in Tier 1, and so some of us need to publish in Tier 2, and even publish in Tier 3 journals. So there are a lot of factors that impact the acceptance rate, and they shouldn't be the acceptance rates should not be the sole guide of, do I publish in this journal or do I publish in that journal? Again, look at the kinds of manuscripts that are published in that journal. Does it fit with your research agenda? For example, there are some journals that only publish qualitative research and others that only publish quantitative research. So if you're a qualitative researcher, you're not going to want to submit a manuscript to a quantitative research journal. So you have to use some wisdom in making decisions about which journal to publish in and which one not to. But don't just rely on the very simplistic notion of an acceptance rate. And it does not necessarily indicate that this is a high-quality journal, because, again, you have to look at the impact factor of that journal, too. There are some journals that have maybe a lower tier. They're a tier 2 journal, but they have a very high impact factor. Or they're at the lower end of tier 1, but they have a lot more citations than another journal that has maybe a higher impact factor. So again, acceptance rates are somewhat misleading and should not be your only measure of whether to choose this journal to publish in or not. If you are familiar with anthropology or archaeology, as I pursued that degree when I was in an undergrad program, then the skull on the upper left, right-hand side of the screen will be familiar to you. It is the Piltdown Man, as it was named. And this particular skull was found in 1912 by a Charles Dawson, who was an amateur archaeologist. And as this find was presented to experts, it was claimed to be a missing link between apes and mankind, evidence of an intermediary step between the two. Unfortunately, it was found to be a fraud in 1953, a little more than 40 years later. What had happened was the curator at the London Natural History Museum, a man by the name of Martin Hinton, had taken a fully developed human skull and the lower jaw of an orangutan, and he filed it and shaped it and stained it to make it look really, really old, and presented it to Mr. Dawson, who buried it and then found it again. And this was an elaborate hoax, is from what we can tell, to embarrass the paleontology curator at the museum, because the thought was that he couldn't spot this obvious fraud, this obvious forgery. And it became well known in scientific circles as this huge research fraud. And what we see from it is that even in circles where you would not expect there to be fraud and malfeasance and the cooking of data, we find it happening all of the time. So the definition fraud here is the manufacturing or falsifying of the preparation or reporting of research results. And why we're seeing fraud increasing over the years is because there are so many journals out there that don't do due diligence in checking to be sure that the research is valid research. And so people are getting around it so that they can get credit for things that they're not doing, or to get more credit than maybe what they deserve. So there are some types of fraud that are commonly practiced even in research circles. The first one, known as salami slicing, is basically reporting the same research data, either the whole data or a part of the data, in multiple journals, and presenting it as if it was a new study or new data. They use the term salami slicing because salami is a meat that is prepared in a casing, as you see here on the lower right-hand side of the slide. And once it's cured, you slice it into pieces and you put it on sandwiches, or you eat it maybe just with your own hands. But the idea is you're trying to cut the data so finely that you can use it multiple times. And basically it's trying to cheat at not having to find new data sets and new research populations, trying to get more out of the data than maybe you possibly could. And of course that's because of the pressure to publish. It takes time to gather these research studies together and find respondents, and so this way you can kind of use the same data pool multiple times and use it in different studies. Another type of fraud that we see very commonly is the duplicate publication. And in the duplicate publication, what the author will do is they will submit a study or an article manuscript to a journal. It will be accepted, and then they will take that same article, change the title, change the keywords, rearrange the article in some fashion, reorganize it maybe a little bit differently, changing words here or there to kind of freshen it up a bit, and submit it to another journal and get it published in another journal. It's not a different article, it's the same article, maybe just slightly modified. But what they're doing is they're trying to get multiple credit for the same article. It's unethical to do that. Where salami slicing is not unethical, but it's highly questionable as a practice. And universities and publishing outlets are looking into this and trying to prevent it from happening, because they say that that's not what should be done in a research study. Now, I've had colleagues who have done that on a number of cases when I was working with journals, and you would see an article and you'd kind of question, wait a minute, I think I've seen this before somewhere. And as you've investigated, you begin to see that this is virtually the same article. Another type of academic fraud is the ghost author. And this is where people are put on the article as authors who had nothing or very, very, very little to do with the publication of the article. It happens in many cases where the department chair is expecting that any research that is conducted in his or her department, he is to have his name on that. Or you'll see the dean have the name on there, and they've done little, if anything, in the study itself. And basically all it is trying to beef up their vitas to show that they've done all this research, when in fact, really, they've not done anything with it. And this, too, is being looked at by universities more carefully, because, of course, in the tenure promotion process, if you are ghost authoring articles, you're getting credit for other people's work. And even if they voluntarily put your name on it, you did not do that work, and you should not receive the credit for it. Plagiarism, of course, that's pretty obvious, but it is copying another person's work and putting your name on it. And lastly, just general fraud. We've seen that with the Piltdown Man case. So these are concerns that universities are looking into. Obviously, publishers are looking into it as well, to find ways to prevent them from happening on a regular basis. And I encourage you to be very careful in the preparation of your research. Universities take a very, very hard look at these kinds of cases, and faculty members are being terminated for fraud in research. And so I just warn you that if you're doing these things, you need to stop. Shame on you for doing them, and you need to stop doing them now, because you're going to find that if you're caught doing this, your reputation will be destroyed, as well as the university, and even that of the journal where you publish your research will be damaged by it. So this is another issue that's gaining quite a bit of attention in research circles. Print versus the electronic journals may not be a large issue in the Philippines. It is still somewhat of an issue here in the United States. The underlying question is a print journal a better place to publish one's research, or a strictly online journal? And in the 90s, when there were very few electric journals, e-journals, and where most of the publications were still in print, it was somewhat of a questionable decision to publish one's research electronically. There was questions about the rigor and how the articles were reviewed. There was just a lot of doubt as to whether an e-journal was at the same level as that of a print journal. Well, since then, 20 years have taken place, and actually most journals now are published online. Where in the 90s, print journals went online and kept their print journal at the same time, now we see journals that are strictly published online and never had a print version. And so they're becoming the common way research is published. There still is a stigma, though, among the purists in the research community about these kinds of journals. And I thought it good to talk a little bit about some things to consider when deciding whether you wanted to publish in an e-journal or not. The first consideration I think that you need to make is looking at the quality of the journal. Is it a Tier 1 journal? And that you'd have to determine based on the Journal of Citation Index or an indexing service such as Cabell's or one of that same caliber. You could look at the impact factor of the journal. Does it rise to that Tier 1 requirement? If you're going to publish, you need to be striving to publish in Tier 1 journals, and that is not easy to do. They are very demanding, and their acceptance rates are very, very low. But yet, this is the place where you're going to see the best research published. Secondly, you need to do some investigation on the publisher, and again, that indexing service can help you with that. Get some details about the organization or the group that publishes the journal. How long have they been in existence? How often do they publish their journals? Do they have any requirements for peer reviewing? And do they set any guidelines on what the research has to look like, things like that. Look at that publisher to be sure it's not just an individual posing as an organization. That happens frequently, where someone wants to start a journal and they are an individual, not really an organization, and they don't have the mechanisms to make sure that the research is properly archived so that it can be retrieved in future years. So there are a lot of concerns about that. That's why you've got to know who that publisher is. I think also it's important to look at circulation of a journal. How many subscriptions are there to it? Obviously, if you're going to publish research, you want to make sure that it's in a journal that is widely read. Not always the only consideration, because there are some journals that have a small circulation, but it's because the topic or the journal itself is what they call a specialty journal and has a very limited audience. But again, you want to get your research out to as many people as possible. So look at circulation. Number 4, I think it's worthwhile for you to consider your own discipline. Do they normally accept e-journals? What's been showing up in the blogs in your discipline that talk about electronic journals? Your university most likely will also have some guidelines as to whether an e-journal is an acceptable place to publish. They may even set requirements for the types of journals that you can publish in. I know mine does. Mine sets that they expect you to be publishing in Tier 1 or Tier 2 journals that are definitely peer-reviewed, and so they do set some guidelines out there that we have to follow, and I suspect that yours does too. Then number 5, look at whether it's peer-reviewed or not. There are some e-journals that are not peer-reviewed, and I don't think that's worth your time. If you're going to publish that, that's about as useful as publishing your research in a journal article or in a newspaper. It's just not going to have the rigor, where it's being reviewed by people who are in the field, who know solid research when they see it. So look to see if it is a peer-reviewed journal. Number 6, there are some advantages of a electronic journal because they have a faster turnaround time in publication, so the review process is shorter, and since everything is electronic, it often happens rapidly. You can submit a paper and within just a few short months have a decision back as to whether it's accepted with or without any modification. So that is a benefit. Another benefit to these e-journals is their ease of access, because you don't have to have that paper journal, and if you don't have it, you don't have to order it. I remember trying to get copies of manuscripts that I had submitted, and it meant a large sum of money having this journal reprinted for one copy. And I'm telling you, the reprint costs can be in the hundreds of dollars to reprint a journal just to get one article. And because they are electronic, they can be out there available to you no matter where you are, at your home, at your office, or even out of the country. So long as you have an internet connection, you can get access to these electronic journals. And I think for that reason, more people are reading them. Some of the research has indicated that doctors and researchers, 3/4 of them would prefer to read journals on online format and e-format, because it is just much easier to search through the article, scan what they're looking for, and look at references and things like that. Also, I guess it's not surprising that many of them also like the e-journals because it is less clutter. A CD, an online version, doesn't take up any space, where having that journal certainly does. And in the corner of my office, I have a stack of journals that I need to either recycle or do something with, because I just don't want to have them around anymore, and they just take up a lot of space. Lastly, there is some thought to the staying power of your research. When you are publishing in electronic journals, if you publish it today, 5 years from now, it'll still be there. You'll still be able to access it. But once it's in print, the printed versions go away, and you either have to track down a printed version or have made a photocopy of it. So there's some benefits here to using these electronic journals. Now, I don't think it's going to continue to be a major issue throughout the research world, but it is a consideration, and you should have some at least some data on your site as to whether this is the proper place for you to publish. I think most of the top journals now have electronic versions, even if they still maintain a paper version. So this is just one of those other issues that I think is going to, over the years, kind of minimize and not even be an issue anymore. It was certainly an issue 20 years ago, but now it's much less of an issue when you consider that 96% of the journals published now are published online. So that's a huge number, and I think it's just going to continue to grow in the years ahead. Another issue that has come up as I've conducted research is this constant battle with, do I publish the article myself or do I collaborate with a group? Now, the research I've done in this area has suggested that people who collaborate end up publishing more articles than those that are sole author. They're single author publications. And there's something about the group dynamics, there's something about the accountability of the group that makes it happen. But what I do ask is, what's the best way to go? Should I strive to collaborate on research with my colleagues and be one of many co-authors, or be the sole author? And this is what happens in the United States. You find institutions will say, what's wrong with this guy? He only publishes by himself. Or the opposite, what's wrong with this guy? He only publishes as a part of a group. How much work is he really doing on this publication? It seems like you get burned either way you go. Personally, I tend to publish by myself. And there are reasons why I do it. First of all, I control the project. It's easier. I don't have to follow somebody else's timeline. I don't have to try to find time to meet with a group of people. I do it all myself, and I do it at a time when it's convenient for me. So if I really feel like I want to research tonight from midnight to 3 a.m., then I can. I don't have to be dependent on getting a group of people together or try to find a way to find a time that we're all able to meet. Also, single author allows me to focus on topics that I'm interested in. And I may have very eclectic interests. My area of interest right now is on higher education. What's going on in higher education? Issues related to higher education. And so when I publish journal articles, that's typically an area where I want to publish. I'm not interested in conducting research much as I am interested in exploring these issues and getting the ideas of other people's research out there for people to consider and have a conversation about. The other advantage of being the sole author, of course, is that the credit is fully mine. I'm the author. I'm not having to share that credit with 5 or 6 other people. What I'm finding is that research wants to see you publish independently as well as they want to maybe see you publish collaboratively. I think there's a greater deal of flexibility when I publish by myself. But certainly on the co-authoring side, there are some benefits too. It can be easier to conduct large research studies because the project can be divided amongst a number of people. It also signifies that you're a team player and not someone who has trouble working with other people. And lastly, you aren't dividing the credit amongst a whole group of people. You're not one of 5 authors. You are the author. Does that sound petty? I hope it doesn't, but it may sound a little on the petty side. But when it comes to research and reputation, people guard that very carefully, especially in Ivy League institutions. It's the sole coin of the realm. It is the way that you can get advancement. And if you do most of your publishing in a group, there are questions about whether you have a defined reputation in the field. So that's just a couple examples of a challenge when it comes to, do I publish as an individual or do I publish as a part of a group? And there are good reasons on either side. But I've noticed that in higher ed, what ends up happening is that early on in your career, it's easier to publish collaboratively, but really by the time you reach associate and full professor, you're probably doing most of your publishing as a single author, or maybe 1 or 2 authors, a very limited number. You're not publishing as a part of a 5-author group or things like that. Again, I think because, you've got your own reputation, you're recognized for that area of research, and when people think of that topic of research, your name automatically comes up because, again, you've defined yourself as an expert in that particular field. In the final analysis, it is a balancing act when we look at how we manage to spread our time between teaching, conducting research, and service, and then on the right side of the scale, how do we balance our home, family, friends, recreation, that personal side of our life? And this has been a challenge for many scholars, is that they seem to lean one way or the other. They either lean towards the work side of the scale or they lean towards the home side of the scale and never really find a way to achieve the balance that they need. There's no argument that the life of a scholar is a challenging one when we look at research and teaching. One might think that those are 2 complementary activities, but they really are very different and require different skills in order to be successful. And so many professors who are in the mode of being a teacher struggle with the research because their passion is to illuminate young minds. And those that are researchers who are curious about things and problems and want to resolve them tend to struggle when they have to take time away from their passion, research, and spend time lecturing and teaching. So the only result is that for each of us, we must find that balance in our own lives. Recognize our strengths, whether it be research or teaching or service, and find ways to bring those other aspects of our job out. Because our job is not just research. It isn't just teaching. It is service as well. And so we have to find a way to make all of these work in harmony. Yeah, it's not easy being the dog on the tricycle with the cat on your head and two mice on either end of the balance pole. It can be done, but it is definitely not an easy task. And that brings us to the end of this session on the pressure to publish and trends and issues in U.S. research. Here's how you can contact me via email. You can contact me at davisr@troy.edu. That's Davis, DAVISR, @troy.edu. I also include my U.S. Mailing address, and that's listed at the bottom of this slide. And you can contact me either way, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
Believe it or not, 20 minutes have already gone by, and it goes by fast when you're having a lot of fun, and I enjoyed being a part of this conference with you. I look forward to future events in May of this year as well as in June. So if you will check out with the conference organizers, they'll be able to tell you when those events are taking place and where. I strongly encourage you to participate in those opportunities because it's important for researchers to get together and share their research and talk about challenges to research and find ways to collaborate one with another. As always, I welcome your comments and your insights into what I've said. You can see on the final slide where my contact information is, and look forward to seeing you at a future conference. I hope that the rest of your time in Baguio is awesome, and look forward to seeing you again. Take care.